My son locked me in a penthouse with guards to steal $800 million. But I sent an SOS through an old elevator. I sometimes wonder what people remember me for. Some might say my buildings, the glass and steel that still glint in the Manhattan sun, 30 and 40 stories tall, etched with the stubborn signature of the 1980s. Back then, I was one of the very few women allowed to put her name to blueprints that would actually rise into the sky. My husband used to say he could always spot which ones were mine. He said they carried softness even in concrete. Light fell differently through my windows. That was a lifetime ago. I'm 70 now and I live quietly, or at least I try to. Most days I shuffle around my apartment in wool slippers, with a pot of Earl Grey on the stove and a notebook still full of sketches I never got to build. The world moved on as it always does. Architects younger than my own grandchildren shape the skyline now. Still, when I ride a cab down Park Avenue, I see the edges of my youth reaching upward, stubbornly alive. After my husband, Richard, passed away 10 years ago, everything became quieter. We had built not just a marriage but an estate, pieces of skyscrapers, office towers, residential spires. Not all ours, no. But we had invested wisely, and through the years I held on to my shares. People thought I was foolish not to sell in the late 90s when the market surged, or in 2008 when everything seemed to collapse. But Richard and I had promised each other, hold steady. And so I did. Now those shares are worth about $800 million. Imagine that. A little girl from Queens, raised in a two-bedroom walk-up above her uncle's deli, sitting on nearly $1 billion worth of Manhattan. I don't say it out loud, of course. Money brings a certain kind of shadow, and I've lived long enough to see how quickly it can turn family into strangers. For the past decade, I have avoided the spotlight. No more magazine profiles about the lady of the skyline. No more ribbon-cutting ceremonies with champagne flutes and flashbulbs. I slip through the city like a ghost, bundled in a wool coat, unremarkable in the crowd. Suits me just fine. Still, money has a way of knocking at your door whether you answer it or not. My son, my only child, David, has always been polite, distant, a little like his father but without Richard's warmth. He chose law, married a lawyer, and the two of them built their lives in conference rooms and court filings. I told myself they were simply busy, but lately, their attention has turned toward me with an intensity that unsettles me. They come by more often now, sometimes with flowers, sometimes with takeout, always with paperwork. My daughter-in-law, Marissa, carries a leather folder everywhere she goes. Just a few things to discuss, she says, with that thin smile lawyers use when they've already decided the outcome. And David, well, he speaks gently, almost rehearsed, as if I might break at any moment. They call it care. Call it intrusion. You see, Richard's absence left me not just alone but in full control. I hold the keys, the accounts, the voting rights. I've never flaunted that. I've never meddled in their affairs. But I also haven't let go. And that, I suspect, is the thorn in their side. I'm not naive. I know what's at stake. Entire skyscrapers, names etched in glossy real estate magazines, fortunes wrapped up in the New York skyline. My name sits on deeds and trusts that others would pay a king's ransom to untangle. It is no small thing to be 70 and still matter in Manhattan. Sometimes at night, I sit by my window and look at the city lights blinking like fireflies. I think about how Richard and I used to climb rooftops in our 20s, scouting shapes against the sky. We thought we could change the world. Maybe in some small way we did. But what lingers most is not the pride of creation, it's the weight of protection. Protecting what we built, protecting the memory of who we were. My health is not what it used to be. My knees ache, my breath shortens too easily, and sometimes I forget where I set down my reading glasses. But my mind, thank the Lord, is still sharp. Sharper than my family realizes. They see gray hair and wrinkles and they think fragility. They don't remember the woman who once drew the circulation plan for a 50-story tower in one sitting, who argued with city inspectors until they bent the code to reason. No, they've already written me into a smaller role, grandmother, widow, old woman with too much money. And maybe I could play that role quietly, if not for the unease that has been growing around me. The first time they brought it up, it was almost casual. We were sitting at my dining table, the one Richard and I had bought in 1978 when we moved into our first brownstone. The wood is worn now, faint rings from too many teacups, but I keep it polished. David leaned across it, his hands folded neatly like he was still in some boardroom, and said, "Mom, we should talk about simplifying things." Simplifying. That was the word he used, as if my life could be boiled down like a sauce until only what they wanted remained. Marissa was with him, of course. She never comes without that leather folder zipped tight, her nails tapping it lightly as if to remind me it's there. She's a bright woman, no doubt, and I once admired her. A lawyer with ambition, sleek in her tailored suits. But over the years, admiration turned to caution. She looks at me not as a mother-in-law but as an obstacle, a wall standing in the way of something she wants. That afternoon she opened her folder, slid a document toward me. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind of stationery meant to impress. Across the top in bold letters, Investment Custody Agreement. I read the title and felt my stomach tighten. "What is this?" I asked, keeping my voice even. "Just a formality," Marissa said smoothly. "Something to ensure your assets are properly managed. For your benefit, of course. Less stress, less confusion." David added, "It's about peace of mind, Mom. You won't have to worry about markets, tenants, quarterly reports. We'll take care of everything." Take care. Those two words can mean love, or they can mean control. I knew which one they meant. I glanced down the page. The language was dense, the sort of legal not meant to confuse. But I've worked with contracts before, building permits, union negotiations, zoning boards. I've untangled more red tape than most lawyers could dream of. My eyes caught the clause buried halfway down. Transfer of ownership rights. Not temporary, not conditional. Permanent. I looked up slowly. "This isn't management," I said. "This is surrender." Marissa's smile never faltered, but her eyes hardened. "It's protection." "No," I replied, my voice firmer than I expected. "It's theft." Silence stretched across the table. David shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening. "Mom," he began, and his tone carried that mixture of impatience and pity only a son can muster. "You don't understand how complicated these things are now. You're 70. You shouldn't be burdened with all this." I laughed then, not loudly but enough. 70 isn't dead, David. I built half my career fighting men who thought I couldn't handle complexity. Don't tell me now that I suddenly can't read my own name on a contract. His cheeks flushed. Marissa closed the folder with a snap. "We'll give you some time to think," she said. Her words were sugar, but her tone was iron. After they left, I sat at the table for a long while, staring at the indent where the folder had pressed against the wood. My hands trembled slightly, though whether from anger or fear, I couldn't tell. I poured myself a cup of tea, but it tasted bitter. That night I walked through my apartment slowly, touching the books Richard and I had collected, the framed blueprints of my buildings, the small photographs tucked into corners. My life, every inch of it, carried weight and meaning. And now my own son wanted to sign it away. I tried to tell myself it was concern, that maybe he truly thought he was helping. But I couldn't shake the way Marissa's eyes had lingered on me, sharp and appraising, as if calculating not years of love and labor but numbers on a ledger. The following week they came again. This time with roses, red as though flowers could disguise chains. Marissa tried again with her calm explanations, her careful assurances. David spoke of family legacy, of protecting wealth for future generations. but every word slid closer to the same point. They wanted me to sign. I refused, of course. Politely at first, then more firmly. Marissa's voice cooled. "It would be easier if you agreed voluntarily," she said. "Easier for whom?" I asked. David avoided my gaze. That hurt most of all. My boy, my only child, suddenly seemed like a stranger at my table. When they left that evening, I knew something had shifted. They wouldn't stop. They couldn't. Not with that much money waiting like bait on a hook. And I, old as I was, had just made myself their greatest problem. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept hearing Richard's voice, his steady laugh, his favorite phrase whenever the world tried to box us in. "Stand tall, Ruth. You built towers. Don't let them make you small." I whispered it back to him in the dark. And I promised myself I would not sign. Not today. Not ever. I should have known they wouldn't take no for an answer. Greed rarely folds its hands and leaves the room politely. It lingers, it schemes, and it waits for its moment. That moment came sooner than I expected. It was a Sunday morning. The city was unusually quiet. That rare kind of hush that drifts in after an overnight rain. I was still in my robe, sipping tea and reading the paper when David arrived. He used his old key, the one I'd given him years ago in case of emergencies. I suppose in his mind this was one. "Mom," he said softly, almost too softly, as though approaching a skittish animal. Behind him came Marissa, her heels clicking across the floor like a metronome. And with them, two men I didn't recognize. Broad shoulders, black suits, earpieces curling into their collars. "Who are they?" I asked, setting down my cup. "Security," David replied quickly. "For your safety. We think it's best if you stay somewhere more private. Less chaotic than the city." Private. That word again, dressed up like a gift but hiding a lock and chain inside. "I already have a home," I said, standing slowly, careful not to show the ache in my knees. "This is temporary," Marissa interjected, her tone polished but firm. "Just until everything is settled. You'll be more comfortable with staff to help. Meals prepared, doctors nearby. You deserve care, not stress." Care. Such a lovely word when spoken by someone who truly means it. But on her lips it was a cage. The men stepped forward gently, not touching me, but close enough to remind me of my own fragility. For a moment my heart rattled in my chest like a bird trapped in a too small cage. But I straightened my shoulders. "I don't need a nursemaid," I snapped. David's face tightened. He didn't argue. Instead, he simply placed a hand on my arm, firm, unyielding, and said, "Come on, Mom. Let's not make this harder than it has to be." They took me not to some distant estate, but upstairs to the penthouse I technically owned. I'd always kept it empty, preferring the warmth of my own apartment several floors below. But now they insisted I settle in. The penthouse was beautiful. Yes, marble floors, tall windows, views that stretched clear across the Hudson. But it felt cold, like a hotel room staged for someone else's life. The refrigerator was stocked, the closets already filled with clothes in my size. It dawned on me, with a chill that went deeper than bone, that this had been planned. Long before my refusal, they had prepared this prison in silk. The security men lingered in the hallway outside. They smiled politely, called me ma'am, but never left their post. My phone disappeared that first evening, replaced with a simpler model that had only pre-programmed numbers, David, Marissa, and the building staff. I wasn't free. Not really. The first night, I lay in the enormous bed staring at the ceiling. The city lights flickered through the curtains, but they felt distant, unreachable. I thought of Richard again, of how we used to sneak onto construction sites late at night, climbing skeleton staircases, watching our dreams take shape in steel. He would never have let me be boxed in like this. But he wasn't here. I was alone. Days passed in a strange rhythm. Meals arrived promptly, prepared by a chef I hadn't asked for. Marissa stopped by with documents, gently circling back to the agreement. It would end all this tension, she said sweetly, tapping the folder as though it were an invitation to peace. David visited less often, his eyes clouded with something I couldn't quite name. Guilt perhaps, though it sat awkwardly on his face. Or maybe it was just calculation, the weighing of blood against concrete. I tried to test the limits. One afternoon, I asked the guards if they would accompany me on a walk around the block. "Better to stay inside, ma'am," one replied, not unkindly. "Doctor's orders." Doctor? I hadn't seen a doctor. At least not one of my choosing. That was when the panic began to bubble beneath my ribs. I realized this wasn't just persuasion anymore. It was containment. And yet, even in that gilded cage, a stubborn spark refused to dim. They had underestimated me. They thought 70 meant helpless. They thought wrinkles meant weakness. But I am an architect. I have spent my life reading the hidden veins of buildings, the systems no one notices until they fail. Ducts, panels, circuits. As I walked the penthouse halls, my hands trailing the walls like a blind woman, I began to see it. The seams. The possibilities. They had locked me in. But they had locked me in my own building. And in my bones I knew one thing. No one knows a building better than the woman who helped design it. This was not the end. This was the beginning. The strange thing about captivity is how quickly silence becomes louder than noise. The penthouse had no real life in it. The marble floors didn't creak like my old apartments did. The refrigerator hummed, the vents sighed, but otherwise there was only the shuffle of my slippers against polished stone. I was meant to feel cared for, cocooned. Instead, I felt like a specimen under glass. But if there's one thing the years taught me, it's that no building is perfect. Every system, no matter how elegant, has seams, places where the bones show if you know how to look. And I, after all, had made a career of looking. One afternoon, after the guards outside had rotated, always at exactly noon, a detail I'd filed away, I wandered to the service elevator at the far end of the hall. Most people never noticed it, tucked behind an unmarked door. But my hands remembered the layout long before my eyes confirmed it. When I pressed the call button, the elevator groaned like an old friend. This wasn't one of the sleek, polished lifts meant for tenants. No, this was older, one of the original systems kept for maintenance staff. Its panel was a relic, brass edges, buttons worn smooth by decades of hands. I traced the grid of numbers with my finger, remembering. Back in the 1980s, when we designed the building, we still used mechanical overrides. No digital screens, no glossy touchpads. The newer renovations had added those, of course, but no one ever fully removed the old guts. Too expensive, too messy. That was the beauty of it. The bones of the building remained just beneath the paint. I leaned close, pretending to study my reflection in the dull brass, while my mind ran over the old blueprints I had once sketched. Yes, here. Beneath the 12 button, hidden in the panel, ran the wiring for the auxiliary system. A communications link originally designed for engineers to signal from elevator to control room in case of emergency. Most people wouldn't know it existed. But I did. That night, after the guards had settled with their magazines in the hall, I slipped back with a small screwdriver I'd smuggled from the kitchen. My hands trembled. Age and adrenaline conspiring against me, but slowly I pried open the panel. The smell of dust and copper rose up like incense, familiar, oddly comforting. Inside, the wires gleamed dull red and black, a nest of history. I smiled to myself. It was like seeing old friends. I tapped a rhythm against the circuit, not random but coded. Back in the day, Richard and I used to leave each other little patterns on drafting paper. 3 lines, pause, 2 lines, pause, 1. Our private shorthand for, help me. I don't know why that came to me then, except perhaps instinct. Architects live by codes, drawings, measurements, signals. Felt right. Over the next 2 days I refined it. Using the old circuitry, I managed to piggyback a signal onto the maintenance system. It was weak, crackling, but I pushed it again and again, sequences of numbers, pulses of light that would look like static to anyone else. But to the right eyes, to someone who knew urban systems, who studied infrastructure the way I once did, it would mean something. I couldn't know if anyone would see it. But hope is its own kind of fuel. Each night I returned, tapping out my message like Morse code to the walls of Manhattan. I am being held. I am still here. In the daylight, I played the role they wanted. I smiled faintly when Marissa brought new papers. I listened when David spoke of family stewardship. I even let the guards think I was growing docile, resigned. But inside, I carried the secret heat of defiance. Sometimes I caught my reflection in the penthouse windows, an old woman with silver hair, her shoulders stooped. But my eyes were the same as when I was 30, standing in a hard hat at a construction site, shouting over the roar of machinery. One evening, as the city lights blinked on below, I sat at the window and whispered, "Richard, I've built one more signal for us. Let's see if the city still listens." I didn't know then that someone was listening. That somewhere, in the thrum of Manhattan's endless networks, my old code was slipping through the cracks. But I felt it. That quiet certainty architects know when a design holds true. My building, my cage, had become my ally. And for the first time since they locked me in, I slept with a smile. The city speaks and hums and groans, in the low rattle of subway cars, in the sigh of steam through manhole grates. I'd always believed that if you listened closely enough, New York would answer back. So when I tapped my code through that ancient elevator panel, I prayed it would carry through the veins of the building, out into the wider grid, and land in the hands of someone who still knew how to listen. And someone did. It happened on a Tuesday. I didn't know, of course, not right away. I was sitting in the penthouse living room, pretending to read one of the glossy magazines Marissa had left on the table, Senior Living Choices, if you can believe it, when I caught a flicker of recognition in one of the guards' faces. He had his phone out, trying to be discreet, scrolling quickly before tucking it back in his pocket. Something about the way he avoided my gaze told me news was moving faster than they expected. Later that night, I overheard them whispering in the hall. "It's online," one said. "Already trending." My heart skipped, though I kept my face calm when they peeked in. Online. Trending. 2 words I never thought would be my salvation. The truth was this. A small group of tech journalists had been running a column about urban ghosts, strange signals in the city's infrastructure. They hunted for anomalies in subway systems, traffic lights, elevator networks. Most were nothing more than glitches. But when they intercepted my repeated sequence, precise, rhythmic, too deliberate to be random, they knew they had found something human. One of them, a young woman named Lila, recognized the structure immediately. Her father had been an engineer, she later wrote, and he'd taught her the old emergency codes. She pieced it together, line by line, until the message appeared clear as day. Help. Held against will. Owner of property. Manhattan. By morning, the first article appeared on a small but respected tech blog. Headline: Is a Manhattan co-owner sending an SOS through the walls? First it sounded like conspiracy, but the post spread, picked up by bigger outlets hungry for anything unusual. Within hours my name appeared, carefully at first, hidden behind phrases like unverified reports and possible connection. They noted that I still held significant stakes in several skyscrapers, that I hadn't been seen in public for weeks. And then the photographs. Someone leaked an old headshot of me, smiling at a ribbon cutting in 1991, hard hat perched on my head, hair windblown, eyes fierce. That picture began circulating alongside the story. "Where is she now?" the captions asked. I didn't see it myself, not yet. But I felt it. The guards grew restless, their conversations shorter, their eyes darting when the phone buzzed. Marissa arrived that evening, sharp as ever, but her smile cracked around the edges. "Don't read anything online," she said briskly, as though I had access. "It's nonsense. Journalists chasing ghosts." I raised an eyebrow. Ghosts often have a way of rattling the living. Her eyes narrowed. For a moment I thought she might strike me, but she only pressed her lips thin and swept out of the room. That night, alone in the wide, cold penthouse bed, I whispered into the dark. "They heard me, Richard. Someone out there heard me." By the next day, the story had snowballed. Larger papers picked it up, running with bolder headlines. "Elderly architect disappears amid billion-dollar holdings." Satellite radio shows debated whether I had been silenced by family, by developers, by some shadowy cabal. The theories were wild, but at their center lay one stubborn truth. I was missing, and the city wanted to know why. The pressure shifted almost immediately. The guards no longer called me ma'am. They called me miss, curtly, like a burden. My meals arrived later, sometimes cold. And Marissa stopped bringing papers. But I didn't mind, because I knew the world beyond those windows was finally looking my way again. It is a strange thing to become news. To have your life boiled down into a headline, your face reduced to pixels, your voice carried by strangers you've never met. But in that moment I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Relevance. Not because of the money, not because of the buildings, but because my story, my truth, was being pulled into the light. The city was listening. And soon I knew the law would be too. The thing about whispers in New York is that they never stay whispers for long. The city is a hive, every word carried from subway seats to coffee counters, from office lobbies to newsrooms. By the time the journalists had finished speculating about my ghost signals, the noise had grown too loud for the authorities to ignore. The FBI came into it almost by accident, or so I later learned. Someone at the Bureau had been monitoring unusual infrastructure reports, the kind that might hint at cyber attacks. When my coded tap showed up in those files, deliberate, structured, insistent, it raised more than one eyebrow. And when a junior agent cross-checked the signal against property records, they found my name. A 70-year-old architect, still holding hundreds of millions in Manhattan real estate, absent from public view for months. That was enough to push me from oddity into potential victim of financial crime. I didn't know any of this at the time, of course. What I knew was the shift in the air around me. The guards grew restless, more frequent in their calls. David's visits stopped altogether. And Marissa, well, she came once, storming through the penthouse like a woman chasing a fire she couldn't put out. "You're making this worse," she hissed at me, leaning close enough that I could see the tiny crack in her lipstick. "These stories, they'll ruin everything. For you. For us. Don't you understand?" "Oh, I understand," I said, my voice steady though my heart pounded. "What I don't understand is how my own family thinks locking me away counts as care." Her jaw clenched. She left without another word. It wasn't long after that the first knock came. Not at my door, but at theirs, the Bureau visiting their law firm, their bank, the developers they dined with. Quiet at first, questions wrapped in politeness. But questions nonetheless. And then the break. The journalists published again. This time with more than speculation. They had spoken with other families, elderly property owners who had also vanished from public view, their assets tied up in eerily similar agreements. Men and women in their 70s and 80s, suddenly too frail to manage their holdings, conveniently replaced by guardianship contracts their children or lawyers swore had been signed voluntarily. But the signatures wavered. The clauses matched too perfectly. A pattern emerged. The FBI saw it too. What had begun as one strange SOS signal now widened into a network of developers, bankers, and attorneys quietly rewriting Manhattan's ownership map by targeting its oldest landlords. I remember the night I realized the Bureau had stepped fully in. The guards outside my door argued in low voices, one of them saying, "If they come here, it's over." That was all I needed to hear. Hope surged in me so strongly I had to grip the window frame just to steady myself. I looked out at the skyline, my skyline, lit up against the night, and whispered, "Come find me. I'm still here." Days later the sound came. A different knock, heavy, commanding. Voices that did not belong to Marissa or her hired men. "FBI." I heard firm through the door. "Open up." I wasn't allowed to see what followed. The shuffle of feet, the clipped protests, the scuffle of authority being resisted and then subdued. But I heard it all. Each sound a note in a symphony of justice long overdue. And then the door to my penthouse opened. A man in a dark suit stepped in, badge raised, eyes scanning me quickly, professionally. "Ma'am," he said, "are you name withheld for now? Are you safe?" For a moment my throat closed. 70 years of pride don't dissolve easily. But in that instant, I wanted nothing more than to collapse into someone else's certainty. Still I drew myself upright, shoulders square. "I am her," I said. "And no, I have not been safe. Not in my own home. But I will be now." He nodded once, crisp. "You will be. We're taking over from here." Behind him, I caught the sight of Marissa being led away. Her face pale with fury, not fear. And somewhere down the hall, I thought I heard David's voice, raised in protest, cracking under the weight of a truth he could no longer bend. It wasn't freedom yet. But it was the first true crack in the walls of my captivity. And I knew then the fight had only just begun. The Bureau worked quickly. Faster than I ever expected. Perhaps they sensed the rot ran deeper than one family squabble. Deeper than one widow locked in her own penthouse. Once they pulled the first thread, the whole tapestry began to unravel. For days after they removed the guards and escorted Marissa away in handcuffs, I was surrounded by agents and investigators. They treated me kindly, though I could see the hunger in their eyes, the hunger for answers. They wanted details, dates, copies of documents. And I, architect to the bone, gave them structure. I laid out what I remembered. The conversations at my dining table, the language buried in the custody agreement, the sudden insistence on my isolation. I told them about the guards, the swapped-out phone, the way every choice of mine had been shaved down to nothing. But the truth was, my story was only one tile in a mosaic. The real breakthrough came when the FBI raided several law offices linked to Marissa's firm. Boxes upon boxes of nearly identical contracts were seized, thick with legalese, but all following the same pattern. Elderly owners, vast properties, and quiet signatures transferring control. The most chilling part was how ordinary the documents looked. To an untrained eye, they were just paperwork, all the right stamps, all the right notary seals. But line them up side by side, and you could see the pattern clear as the skyline at dawn. Entire fortunes were being funneled from aging hands into the pockets of developers who already held too much power. I remember sitting across from a young agent, maybe 30 at most, hair cropped short, his tie askew after a 14-hour day. He spread the contracts across the table in front of me like playing cards. "It's everywhere," he said, shaking his head. "Your case isn't an exception, ma'am. It's the model." The model. That word chilled me. In the following weeks, names began to spill into the papers. Developers I'd once shaken hands with at gala dinners, bankers who had toasted Richard and me when our first building broke ground, lawyers who had smiled as though we were family. Each headline struck me like a hammer. Elderly owners targeted in billion-dollar property scheme. Guardianship contracts at heart of scandal. Network of developers accused of asset theft. And there, woven into the mess, was my own name. At first simply as the whistleblower. Then as a symbol. The architect who fought back. One paper called me. I wasn't sure how I felt about that. Proud, yes, but also tired. The attention was dizzying, the calls relentless. Journalists begged for interviews. Advocacy groups sent letters. Strangers wrote to thank me, saying their parents or grandparents had been pressured in similar ways. But what steadied me most were the other victims. The Bureau arranged meetings, safe, confidential gatherings where we could speak. I sat in a quiet room with men and women older than me, their faces lined with the same bewilderment I had carried. A retired teacher whose apartment shares had been signed away after her son insisted she was forgetful. A widower who had been locked in a nursing home, while his nephew sold off his block of properties. Each story was a mirror of mine, twisted just slightly but unmistakable. We were not isolated incidents. We were a pattern. And when you can show a pattern, you can prove intent. The scandal erupted into something larger than I had imagined. Congressional hearings were announced. Advocates demanded reforms to guardianship laws. And the FBI held a press conference, standing before a sea of microphones to confirm what the press had already guessed. This was a coordinated scheme, worth billions, stretching across the city's skyline. The day they unsealed the indictments, I sat in my living room with a mug of tea cooling in my hands. On the television, the anchor read the charges one by one. Fraud, conspiracy, unlawful detention. Names I knew, names I had once trusted, were read aloud like a litany of betrayal. Among them Marissa. And to my heartbreak, David. I had known it deep down, but hearing it aloud still cracked something inside me. The city buzzed with the scandal. Outside my building, cameras gathered, shouting questions when I passed. Some wanted to know how it felt to be at the center of it all. Others wanted to know whether I hated my son. I didn't answer those. Not yet. Some truths take longer to speak. Instead, I told the world what mattered. That older generations are not disposable. That our voices do not vanish the moment our hair turns white. That buildings are built to endure. And so are the people who raise them. The more I spoke, the more people listened. And the more the scheme came into light, the more it began to crumble. What they had built was not a fortress. It was a house of cards. And at last the wind was blowing. The courtroom smelled faintly of polish and old wood, the kind of smell that settles into benches after decades of trials. I'd walked through plenty of courtrooms before in my career, but never as the center of it. Never with cameras lined along the back wall, their red lights blinking like watchful eyes. They told me it was my choice whether to testify publicly. I could have done it quietly behind closed doors, a deposition filed away in some folder. But no, I'd been hidden long enough. If they wanted my silence, they would have to hear me instead. So there I was, seated at the witness stand, palms pressed lightly against the smooth rail, my heart beating so hard I could feel it in my teeth. The room hushed as the judge called me forward. "State your name," the clerk said. I leaned toward the microphone. My voice came out steady, stronger than I expected. "My name is Ruth Kaplan. I am 70 years old. I am a retired architect. And I am the rightful owner of shares in multiple Manhattan properties." That was how it began. The prosecutor guided me gently at first, asking about my career, about the buildings I had designed, the skyline I had helped shape. They wanted the jury, and the nation, to see me as more than just an old woman in a gray suit. They wanted them to see my life's work. Then came the harder questions. The day my son slid that contract across my table. The way Marissa's eyes hardened when I refused. The locks, the guards, the penthouse turned into a cage. I spoke plainly, without embellishment. I told them how I had found the old elevator panel, how I'd tapped out my distress signal night after night. The courtroom leaned in closer with each word, as though the entire city were holding its breath. And when I described the moment the FBI finally came through the door, I saw jurors glance at one another, their lips pressed tight. They understood. They believed me. The defense tried to cut me down. Marissa's lawyers argued that the agreement was standard, that I had been confused, that their clients had only sought to protect me. They even hinted at senility, suggesting that perhaps my memory had colored events unfairly. I straightened in my chair. My voice sharpened. I designed skyscrapers in this city for 30 years, I said, fixing my gaze on the jury. I argued with contractors, bankers, city inspectors. I stood on rooftops at 2 in the morning with blueprints in my hands and wind in my face. Do I look like a woman who confuses her own life? A ripple of reaction moved through the room. Muffled coughs, the scratch of pens, a camera shutter. Then came the moment that broke me open. The prosecutor asked gently, "And who was behind this? Who presented you with these papers? Who attempted to isolate you?" I hesitated. My mouth felt dry as sand. "My son," I said finally. The words sliced through me as they left. "David Kaplan. My only child." Gasps fluttered through the courtroom. The cameras caught every flicker of pain across my face. But I didn't stop. "He was not alone," I continued. "He was guided, pushed by his wife, by lawyers, by developers. But yes, he stood at my table. He pressed the papers into my hands. He locked me away when I refused. And that truth is heavier than any steel beam I ever worked with." For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the microphones. Then the prosecutor asked his last question. "Why are you telling this story now, Mrs. Kaplan?" I looked at the jurors, at the judge, at the cameras beyond them that carried my image into living rooms across the country. "Because buildings outlast people," I said softly. "But only if you build them strong. And families outlast too if you build them on love, not greed. My legacy is not for sale. Not to my son. Not to anyone. And if they can do this to me with my resources, imagine what they have done to others with none. This must stop here. Now." I don't remember sitting down afterward. I only remember the sound. Applause is not permitted in courtrooms, but the murmur that rose then was like a tide breaking. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras flashed. The judge's gavel hammered for silence, but the message had already left the room. By evening, my testimony was replayed on every major network. Elderly architect testifies against son in billion-dollar scheme. They ran clips of me at 30, cutting ribbons, alongside clips of me at 70, testifying with eyes steady as steel. I hadn't just spoken for myself. I had spoken for all of us. And the world had finally heard. Trials are slow things. Buildings at least rise on a clear schedule: foundation, frame, walls, windows. You can see progress with your own eyes. But justice? Justice crawls. Still it came. David and Marissa sat at the defense table each day, stone-faced. Sometimes when the cameras weren't looking, I caught my son's eyes. He didn't glare, didn't plead, didn't soften. Just stared, flat as glass, as though I were no longer his mother but a wall in the way of his plans. That, more than anything, broke my heart. The prosecutors laid out the scheme piece by piece. They showed the stack of nearly identical guardianship agreements. They called witnesses, bankers, secretaries, even a few frightened notaries who admitted they'd been pressured to look the other way. The pattern was undeniable. A web spun tight around the elderly, catching their assets until there was nothing left. When the verdict came, the courtroom was packed. I sat in the front row, hands folded in my lap, a handkerchief clutched in one palm though I hadn't shed a tear in days. "Guilty," the foreman said. Again and again the word rang out. Guilty of fraud, guilty of conspiracy, guilty of unlawful detention. Marissa closed her eyes but did not flinch. David stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. I pressed the handkerchief to my mouth, not to hide tears but to steady my breathing. It was finished. The sentencing came later. Several developers, men whose names once glittered in real estate magazines, received decades in prison. Lawyers who had drafted the false contracts were disbarred. Some sentenced too. Banks scrambled to distance themselves, their executives sweating under subpoenas. And then came David and Marissa. The judge's voice was stern, measured. "You abused trust. You exploited family bonds for financial gain. You attempted to silence the very person you should have protected. 15 years for Marissa. 10 for David. The numbers echoed in my head. 15. 10. A decade of my son's life. Lost, wasted, rotting in a cell. I should have felt triumph, but all I felt was a hollowness I could not name. Reporters swarmed me outside the courthouse, their microphones thrust forward like spears. Mrs. Kaplan, do you feel justice has been served? I paused, the autumn wind tugging at my scarf. The cameras caught my every blink, my every breath. Justice has been served, I said finally. But justice does not heal a family. It cannot turn back time. My son is guilty, yes. But he is also my son. That truth will ache inside me until my last day. The papers called me a heroine. Some called me a martyr. Others painted me as a warning. A symbol of the dangers families can pose when money eclipses love. My name was suddenly everywhere again, splashed across headlines as if it were 1989 and I just unveiled another tower. Strangers wrote letters. Some thanked me. Others told me of their own betrayals. Sons who emptied bank accounts, daughters who sold homes without permission, nephews who slipped contracts in front of weary hands. I read each one slowly, a chorus of grief too familiar to ignore. Advocacy groups began to call, asking me to speak, to lend my voice to reform. You've become the face of resistance, one young woman told me over the phone. I almost laughed. 70 years old, arthritic knees, gray hair in a bun. And yet here I was, a face of something larger than myself. I agreed, of course. How could I not? If my pain could shield someone else, then it wasn't wasted. I appeared at hearings, at conferences. Each time I spoke plainly. We are not fragile ornaments to be tucked away. We are the foundations. Without us, the towers fall. But when the microphones were gone, when the applause faded, I returned to the quiet of my apartment. Alone. At night, I sometimes dreamed of David as a boy. Sticky fingers clutching Lego bricks. Eyes wide as he begged me to tell him how skyscrapers stood without falling. I would draw little diagrams on napkins, triangles and beams, and he'd nod solemnly, as though I'd given him the secrets of the universe. What happened to that boy? Where did he go? I may never know. But I do know this, the city remembers. My building still stands strong against the skyline. My story too now stands, not just mine but all of ours who were nearly erased. Resolution is never perfect. It is not joy. It is not peace. It is a settling of dust after demolition. And in that dust, if you squint hard enough, you can see the outline of something new being built. For me it was resilience. For the city perhaps a warning. And for those who thought they could rewrite my life into their own, it was the end. The day I returned to my own apartment, the doorman smiled at me the way he used to, with warmth and not pity. "Welcome home, Mrs. Kaplan," he said, and those words nearly undid me. Home. After all that time locked above it, I was finally walking back into the place I'd chosen, not the one chosen for me. The apartment smelled faintly of lavender and old paper, just as it always had. Dust had gathered on the bookshelves, but my chair by the window was waiting, my teapot gleaming faintly in the kitchen light. Nothing monumental had changed, yet everything had. I walked to the window, leaning my palms against the glass. The skyline stretched before me, bold, stubborn, alive. My skyline. There was the tower Richard and I had once argued about for weeks until I insisted the atrium needed more light. There was the sleek office building that nearly broke us financially until the tenants came pouring in. And beyond, so many others I had touched, if only in detail. They still stood. Strong. Unyielding. I whispered to Richard as though he were beside me. "We did it, love. They tried to take it all, but the buildings hold. The truth holds. We hold." The city pulsed with life below. Horns honking, lights flickering, voices rising from the street. I thought about the years ahead, fewer than behind me of course, but still mine. No one would ever again decide for me where I could live, whom I could trust, or what I should surrender. My son and his wife were gone from my daily life now, their futures reduced to prison walls. The ache of that truth will never leave me. But I know this. Their attempt to steal my legacy was only a shadow. My work, my buildings, my stubborn refusal to vanish, those are the things that endure. I sat down in my chair, brewed myself a fresh pot of tea, and let the steam rise around me. Outside my window the sun dipped low, painting the towers gold. And I thought, this is enough. To have built something lasting. To have kept it safe. To still be here to see it. The city would move on as it always does. But my mark was etched in glass and steel, in lines drawn against the sky. That cannot be erased. They tried to lock me away. But I am still standing. And so are my buildings. My dears, if in this story you saw yourselves, be sure to write about it in the comments. I would be very interested to read it. Thank you.